I was asked by a colleague to give some suggestions for transforming her mother tongue science lesson into CLIL. And that was at the beginning of the pandemic. And since then, I've been asked to do quite a lot of individual kind of personal jobs with colleagues to do with CLIL. And it gave me the idea that it might be useful to colleagues to offer this example and then an invitation. If there's a need, get in touch and send me your questions and materials. We'll deal with it like in a clinic, and I'll help you turn your stuff into 3D CLIL lessons and materials. So we're going to start here with the water cycle, and this is subtitled Turning Mother Tongue Lesson Material into CLIL. And as this colleague asked, can I use the three-dimensional approach to CLIL for my own mother tongue lesson? Well, of course, I think that will come out in this description. The procedures, concepts, and language apply whatever the language. It's just that in a foreign language, you turn up the volume of the language, to use the music studio metaphor. So what we've got here is grade 3 science from a Taiwanese textbook. It's in Chinese, and what the colleague did was send me. I mean, initially you can see what some of the concepts are on these pages, even if you don't speak Chinese like I don't. But I can see that there's an amount of water in a Petri dish. It's probably an observation experiment looking at how water reduces over time. And you've also got droplets on the side of a glass, probably to do with looking at condensation. So evaporation and condensation, we can see from the visual what's happening in these pages. And the colleague provided me with a translation. And then I began to audit the translation, looking for the 3 dimensions, so procedures, concepts, and language. And I just highlight them. I go through and I look at concepts that are essential, and I look at language that is essential too. So we're looking at language which is repeated, actual structures which are repeated throughout the material. And you can look at 3 layers of language, subject specific, general academic, and then kind of peripheral language of the classroom. And here we can see some phrases such as will disappear appears on 2 occasions. We've got the concept evaporation, and it's dealt with by way of definition, by way of understanding. And it's also got a reference to examples. And it mentions a crucial concept here, process. So there's going to be some process description as well. And to go back to the language box, vaporizes ... turns into. So you're going to have some of this process description from one state to another. And the concepts, in summary, we've got evaporation, condensation. These 2 processes are described. We've got some aspects of description, so language which deals with steps, describing conditions at different steps within these processes. And we've also got some examples from everyday life. The language highlighted, as I say, I've highlighted it in terms of subject-specific terms, general academic terms, and then peripheral language. And in terms of subject-specific terms, well, evaporate, vapor, vaporize, condense, condensation, absorb are all there in these pages. And we've got then general academic language for defining, for describing conditions, for describing process and cause effect. And we've got peripheral language, which is more to do with explaining what to do, giving instructions. We've got some sequencing phrases, which kind of bridges the space between general academic and peripheral classroom instruction language. The procedures are quite kind of minimal on the pages. We've got making observations, looking at the level of water and how that changes over time and temperature, and droplets on a container, again with change in temperature. And there are some multiple choice questions on the pages. And during the observation, the learners are asked to carry out an observation of water evaporation, an observation of condensation. And my feeling about this is we might want to have more procedures, you know, because we are talking about a foreign language CLIL versioning of this lesson and material. And we want learners to speak more, and maybe we want them to write a bit as well. So, you know, we might want to use our imagination to add procedures to the collection that's already there. So thinking about inputs, I asked the colleague to think about input material and output production of the learner. So think about what text, might be text in the pages you can use, what visuals, there might be some in the pages, what other visuals can you bring to play in this sequence of activities. On the water cycle and evaporation and condensation, video material showing the process, what objects have you got? And in the science book pages, great, you know, we've got experiments with actual equipment that gets learners making their observations. Fantastic. Pictures and animations that you have, make use of them to bring procedure to this sequence that's not there. Rather than just illustrative, use them for interaction and communication. And that can lead us on to outputs. You know, what do we expect learners to say and write in this sequence? If there's nothing there for them to say or write, make something for them to say and write. And I made a few suggestions for the colleague with example materials, using images, using video, using text description, and I'm quite keen on turning input material into communication material so that we can go from processing what they see or hear and read and turning that into sharing, agreeing, sorting activities. And you'll see an example in a moment. Practicing standard structures through asking and answering questions, getting them to build a diagram using the visual and text descriptors with headings, reconstructing the original diagram that we had at the beginning using materials that are provided for them. And they talk about this. So they're using what they've seen and remember with a partner or partners to reconstruct the conceptual diagrams that are at the heart of these processes, evaporation, condensation within the water cycle. And then, you know, if you've got time and energy and you believe they're useful, extra vocabulary activities that may be done within the lesson sequence or self-study using applications like Quizlet. How much are we going to want them to actually write definitions or speak definitions? How much time do we want them to spend on writing a description of these processes? You know, it may depend on what your test items are, what your curriculum says about what they should be able to do. Actually, I think the CLIL versioning of this may even be doing a better job than the mother tongue version of this, because the mother tongue version may have these objectives in the curriculum guidelines, can describe the process of evaporation, but have they been step by step supported up to that moment where they can provide this process description, either spoken or written? Well, in CLIL, we make that happen. What sort of interactive communication are you going to get them to do? Well, as I say, I like to build from the input to paired or small group. Let's have a chat about this and see how we're going to organize it, and then talking happens there. There are lots of other opportunities and other options for creating interaction. What instruments can you produce for scaffolding output? And I put here substitution tables, gap sentences, writing frames. And again, there are lots of options there as well, you know. And I think you really need to have a look at other sources of ideas from here if you're interested in what those options are. You might even write to me and to ask about that. You know, can you give me some ideas about this scaffolding And if you send me your curriculum objectives, your lesson pages scanned, we can work something up together. So material suggestions, I've suggested kind of a step sequence for these pages, and then materials taken from other places. I work with TICTAG a lot because I wrote many of the materials on there and coordinated other writers, and there's some really great quality resources there. And you see an illustration here of the water cycle, which includes the concepts of condensation and evaporation. So using an illustration for labeling while they're processing inputs, yeah? And then we can move from that easy processing of input, because you don't want them to do something too complicated, to something a bit more complicated once they've taken in the general concept. And that might be getting learners to work with text and an illustration, similar illustration that has headings, sequencing phrases, and descriptions for the stages in this water cycle. So what they do here in their pairs or small groups, they've got the cards cut up, they've got one copy of the illustration, and they have to agree with each other where to put the descriptions and the sequencing phrases. And you can follow that up with them feeding back in English to the whole class, one or two retellings of the entire cycle in their small groups. Further interaction, well, here this is again taken from TICTAG. We built in these interactive communicative activities by default in every theme. So this one is in the water cycle theme with sample questions at the bottom for student A to find the missing information, which student B has, and they're talking to each other without showing. They ask and answer questions to fill in the missing information. It's an information gap activity. Quite mechanical, but it practices, as I said, these standard structures of the process. So it's quite useful at this level. A frame for structuring the concepts of an observation, and language scaffolding to help them reproduce the description of the experiment and write down their observations. And here making a bottled cloud, which is a bit like observing the droplets on a chilled glass. And you can see that there are various instruments used here. We've got sentence starters. We've got mixed up sentences to give the instructions, the method of what was done. And then we've got a section called conclusions with gapped sentences to fill in. In TICTAG, we gave two variants, an advanced and a basic. And there are many options depending on your learner's language needs. So final thoughts in this quick run through. Think about the 3 dimensions always. You know, what are the main concepts they have to deal with? What procedures are there already in the pages of the textbook? What language do they need to be able to carry out those procedures? And maybe adding, I should have brackets here, extra procedures where needed for this practice. Building from input to output is something I stress as well. Processing input, leading on to supporting output. Can I help? Send me your questions in lockdown and otherwise. I'm very happy to help.